In the autumn of 1944, an American P-51 Mustang pilot named Urban Drew did something no Allied pilot had done before. He shot down 2 jet aircraft in a single mission. The jets were Messerschmitt Me-262s. They were faster than anything the Allies had in the air. Their engines made a sound pilots described as unlike anything they had ever heard. A high-pitched whine instead of a piston roar, something from a different era entirely. And Drew caught 2 of them at the one moment they were vulnerable. Taking off, slow, gear still down, unable to maneuver. He never would have caught them in level flight. Nobody could. The Me-262 flew at 870 kilometers per hour. The P-51 Mustang, the best piston fighter the Allies produced, flew at 703. That gap of 167 kilometers per hour was not a marginal advantage. It meant the Me-262 pilot chose every engagement. He decided when to attack, when to break off, and when to simply fly away. No Allied fighter could catch him if he didn't want to be caught. Germany had a jet fighter in operational service in 1944. The Allies did not field an operational jet fighter until after the war in Europe ended, and Germany still lost the air war. This is the story of how the most technologically advanced combat aircraft of World War II was wasted by delay, mismanagement, and the personal interference of one man, and what that cost Germany over the skies of Europe. To understand why the Me-262 mattered, you need to understand what it was capable of. Because the technical gap between it and everything else in the air in 1944 was not incremental. It was generational. The Me-262 Schwalbe, Swallow, was powered by 2 Junkers Jumo 004 axial flow turbojet engines, each producing 8.8 kilonewtons of thrust. There was no propeller, no piston, no crankshaft. The engines ingested air at the front, compressed it, mixed it with fuel, ignited it, and expelled the exhaust rearward. The reaction pushed the aircraft forward at speeds that no piston engine could approach. The airframe was equally advanced. The Me-262 had a swept wing, angled back at 18.5 degrees, which reduced drag at high speed in a way that straight-winged aircraft could not match. The tricycle landing gear gave it stable ground handling that conventional tailwheel fighters lacked. The cockpit was pressurized. The instrument layout was modern. Its armament was devastating. The standard Me-262A1A carried 4 30mm Mk108 cannons in the nose. The Mk108 fired a projectile that was larger and heavier than any cannon round mounted on Allied fighters. A single hit from one Mk108 shell could destroy a fighter aircraft. 3 hits would bring down a B-17 Flying Fortress, a 4-engine heavy bomber that could absorb enormous punishment from rifle-caliber weapons and keep flying. For context on what this meant in practice, a B-17 crew that encountered an Me-262 had almost no defense. Their .50 caliber machine guns had a practical defensive range of perhaps 600 meters against a conventional fighter making a slow closing pass. The Me-262 attacked at speeds that compressed that engagement window to seconds. By the time a gunner had tracked the jet, it had already fired and broken away. The Me-262 pilots developed specific attack doctrine for bomber interceptions. Approach from behind at high speed, open fire at 600 meters, break away before the defensive fire could track them. The entire attack run lasted less than 15 seconds. The closing speed was so high that pilots had to consciously resist the instinct to open fire too late. Against Allied fighters, the Me-262 was equally dangerous, but in a different way. It could not turn with a Spitfire or a P-51 in a low-speed dogfight. The jet engines were sluggish to respond to throttle changes, and the aircraft's high landing and takeoff speeds made it vulnerable in those phases of flight. But in level flight, in a dive, or in a zoom climb, nothing Allied could stay with it. The Me-262 was not perfect. It was simply faster than anything it would ever face. The Me-262 did not appear suddenly in 1944. It had been in development since 1938. The aircraft's design began at Messerschmitt AG under the direction of Waldemar Voigt in 1938, when the German Air Ministry issued a specification for a jet-powered aircraft. The first airframe was completed in 1941. The first flight under jet power, using Junkers Jumo 004 engines, took place on July 18, 1942. July 1942, 2 full years before the aircraft entered operational service. Those 2 years were consumed by a combination of genuine technical problems, bureaucratic obstruction, and the now familiar pattern of interference from Hitler that we have seen throughout this series. The technical problems were real. The Jumo 004 engine was revolutionary but fragile. Early versions had a service life of approximately 10 hours before requiring overhaul. The compressor blades were made from steel rather than the nickel alloys used in later jet engines. Germany lacked the strategic nickel reserves to use better material, and they eroded rapidly under the heat and stress of operation. The engines also suffered from compressor stalls if the throttle was advanced too quickly, which could cause a flameout at the worst possible moment. These were solvable problems. They were being solved. But solving them took time, and the bureaucratic environment made everything slower. The German Air Ministry, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, was a bureaucracy at war with itself. Different departments had different priorities. Funding for jet development competed with funding for proven piston aircraft programs that were already in production and already fighting the war. Program managers who had invested their careers in conventional aircraft had no incentive to accelerate a program that might make their work obsolete. By 1943, the Me-262 was approaching readiness. Test pilots were reporting exceptional performance. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm was urgently requesting the aircraft. Allied bombing raids on Germany were intensifying, and the conventional fighter force was suffering severe losses trying to intercept B-17 formations. Then Hitler intervened. In the spring of 1943, Adolf Hitler saw a demonstration of the Me-262. His response set back operational deployment by at least a year. Hitler asked a simple question: can it carry bombs? The answer from the engineers was technically yes. The aircraft had hardpoints that could be fitted with bomb racks. But the question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Me-262 was. Hitler was not interested in a revolutionary fighter that could defend German skies and destroy Allied bombers. He wanted a fast bomber, what he called a blitz bomber, to retaliate against Allied cities and invasion forces. The conceptual problem was severe. The Me-262 was a fighter. Converting it to carry bombs reduced its speed advantage, made it heavier, and degraded the flight characteristics that made it exceptional. More critically, it meant the aircraft would be flying attack missions into defended areas rather than using its speed advantage to intercept attackers over Germany. Everything the Me-262 did well was negated by the bomber role. Hitler issued a direct order. The Me-262 was to be developed and deployed as a bomber. Fighter variants were a secondary priority. Anyone who suggested otherwise was contradicting the Führer. Messerschmitt engineers, Luftwaffe commanders, and test pilots all understood the order was operationally catastrophic. The Me-262 as a bomber would be slower, less capable, and tactically misemployed. As a fighter, it could have changed the defensive air battle over Germany. As a bomber, it would accomplish little and lose aircraft that could never be replaced. They argued. They were overruled. General Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated fighter aces and the Inspector General of the fighter arm, flew the Me-262 in May 1943 and immediately grasped its potential. He described the experience as feeling like being pushed by angels. He began arguing urgently for immediate deployment as a fighter. Hitler had him removed from his position in January 1945 for insubordination. The bomber order stood until late 1944, when the Allied invasion of France and the deteriorating situation on all fronts finally forced Hitler to authorize fighter deployment. By that point, production had been delayed, pilots had been trained for the wrong mission, and the strategic window in which the Me-262 might have made a decisive difference had closed. The delay cost Germany at minimum 1 full year of operational jet fighter deployment. Possibly more. Here is where the Me-262 story diverges from the Tiger tank and the STG-44 and becomes more complicated. The Me-262 was not produced in tiny numbers because of Hitler's interference alone. The production story has multiple layers, and understanding them matters. Total Me-262 aircraft produced, approximately 1,430. Of those, only around 300 were operational at any given time. Of those 300 on any given day, perhaps 100 were actually airworthy due to maintenance demands, fuel shortages, and pilot availability. The number of Me-262s that flew combat missions on any single day was rarely more than a few dozen. Why the gap between 1,430 produced and perhaps 30 flying combat on any given day? The engines. The Jumo 004 required overhaul every 25 hours of operation by the time it entered service. An improvement from the catastrophic early versions, but still a severe maintenance burden. A conventional piston engine might run for 400 hours between overhauls. And Me-262 consumed maintenance resources at 16 times the rate of a conventional fighter. Germany's already strained maintenance infrastructure under constant Allied air attack could not keep pace. The fuel. The Me-262 used J2 aviation kerosene, a different fuel than the conventional aviation gasoline used by piston aircraft. By 1944, Germany's fuel situation was catastrophic. Allied bombing of the synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Berlin, and Zeitz had reduced German aviation fuel production by over 90% from its 1944 peak by the end of the year. An aircraft that can't refuel can't fly. The pilots. Flying a jet in 1944 was genuinely difficult. The throttle response characteristics, the high landing speed, the absence of propeller torque effects that piston pilots relied on for muscle memory, all of it required retraining. Germany did not have the training infrastructure, the time or the fuel for training flights to convert large numbers of experienced piston pilots to jets quickly. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than inexperienced ones could be trained. And Allied air power. By 1944, Allied fighters were specifically hunting Me-262s at their airfields, intercepting them during takeoff and landing when they were slow and vulnerable. The tactic was called airfield strafing, and it destroyed more Me-262s than aerial combat. An aircraft that requires a long concrete runway to operate is vulnerable to an enemy that has air superiority over that runway. The Me-262 was remarkable. It was also being asked to perform a miracle in a war Germany was already losing on every front. Where the Me-262 flew, it was lethal. Jagdgeschwader 7, JG-7, was the primary Me-262 fighter unit. In the final months of the war, flying from bases in Germany, JG-7 pilots achieved kill ratios against Allied bombers that were extraordinary. On March 18, 1945, 12 Me-262s attacked a formation of 1,221 American bombers and 632 escort fighters. They claimed 12 bombers and 1 fighter destroyed, for the loss of 3 Me-262s. That ratio, 12 against over 1,800, illustrates both the Me-262's capability and its limitation. A dozen jets could not stop over 1,000 bombers. They could destroy some, disrupt the formation, and break away before Allied fighters could engage. But they could not change the outcome of the raid. Commando Nowotny, the first operational Me-262 unit, formed in September 1944, achieved similar results. Under ace pilot Walter Nowotny, The unit flew combat missions and accumulated impressive individual kill tallies. Nowotny himself was killed on November 8, 1944, shot down over his own airfield, probably by American P-51s waiting for him to land. His death illustrated the structural problem. The Me-262 was fastest at altitude and in level flight. Near the ground, near its airfield, at low speed, it was vulnerable. Allied air superiority meant that every German airfield was watched. Every landing approach was dangerous. The Me-262 pilots flew and fought with skill. They were being systematically hunted between missions. By early 1945, Germany formed Jagdverband 44, JV-44, a special unit commanded by Galland himself, flying Me-262s with Germany's most experienced surviving aces. It was a recognition that only the best pilots could extract the aircraft's full potential. It was also an acknowledgement that Germany had run out of other options. JV-44 fought until April 1945. Its pilots achieved genuine kills against overwhelming odds. It could not affect the outcome of a war where Germany was being pressed from 3 directions simultaneously and had lost air superiority over its own territory. We have now told 4 stories in this series. The Tiger tank, the best weapon, wrong numbers, wrong deployment. The M1 Garand, sufficient weapon, right numbers, right result. The Sturmgewehr 44, right concept, too late, too few. The Me-262, genuine technological superiority, destroyed by delay, misemployment, and a war already lost. Each story is different. The lesson is the same. Revolutionary technology does not win wars by itself. The Me-262 was real. Its speed advantage was real. Its lethality against bombers was real. But it entered operational service a year late because of Hitler's bomber obsession, flew in numbers too small to change the strategic balance, consumed maintenance resources Germany couldn't spare, and operated in an environment where Allied air superiority had already eliminated the conditions the aircraft needed to be decisive. There is a version of this story where the Me-262 matters. It is the version where Germany deploys it as a fighter in 1943, when the strategic bombing campaign was still building, when Germany still had experienced pilots, when fuel was still available, when Allied fighter escort couldn't yet reach deep into Germany. In that version, large numbers of Me-262s intercepting B-17 formations without fighter escort might have made the daylight bombing campaign too costly to sustain. It might have forced the Allies to night bombing only, which was less accurate, less effective against precision industrial targets. It might have bought Germany time. But that version requires a different 1942 and 1943. Different decisions, different priorities, a different man in command. And in the version that actually happened, the Me-262 arrived too late to change a war that Germany's other failures had already decided. The aircraft was extraordinary. The war was already over. Next episode, the bomb. In August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. The war in the Pacific ended within days. The weapon that ended it had cost $2 billion to develop, required 130,000 workers across dozens of secret facilities, and was based on physics that Germany had discovered first. Germany had the scientists. They had the theoretical knowledge. They had a nuclear program. So why didn't they build the bomb? That story of the weapon that could have changed everything and why the country that started the race to build it finished last is next.